Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, my Wendigo encounter. This story takes place in the backcountry of the area I grew up in. Be warned, some of this might be too frightening for some.
Reader discretion is advised.
So back in 2019, I remember there being a big uproar of unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. This story is about probably one of the scariest things I think I've ever heard about. The Wendigo. A few months after one of my friends Jacob mentioned this big uproar, I went to go see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. I got back after being discharged, and one of the first things I did was go and see him. We're having a good old time, and he brought up the idea of going out to a little hangout spot his now ex-girlfriend took him to when they wanted to get away for a few hours. So I decided why not. So I grabbed my gun and we went out to this extremely secluded area and started messing around on the old dock that was there. It had been pretty much forgotten by the looks of it, poorly maintained, and some boards were almost completely rotted through. So about 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a little scary even for me. Curious, I asked him about it. He said that if you went into the woods and said Wendigo 3 times, you would come across the scariest looking thing you've ever seen. Me calling his bluff, I told him to prove it. To this day, I wished I hadn't. We start walking on this little path that lead deep into the thick woods close to the Alabama state line. We walked for maybe 20-ish minutes and decided we were in a good spot. I feel it's worth knowing that it had been raining a lot over the past couple days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. I turned to Jacob, and he dares me to do it. I stood there, in complete silence. The rest of the forest was almost silent as well, besides the tall pines swaying in the wind high above our heads. Reluctantly, I slowly started to say it. Wendigo. 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 Then, nothing happened. I let out a silent sigh of relief at the fact that nothing happened. One thing about mine and Jacob's friendship is we loved it when one of us proved the other wrong about something. In our friendship of 10 years, I think it was one of the first times I had proven him wrong at anything. We started to talk a little bit of shit back and forth at each other when we heard a noise in the distance. Me still having the reflexes I had from the Marines, I immediately snapped towards the direction of the noise that were just then turning into noises. I started to move closer to the noises, and then shortly after we saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. I breathed another sigh of relief. But that relief didn't last long since I knew something was up. I didn't know what was up at first, but I just knew it was time for me and Jacob to leave. As we turned to leave the woods, all of a sudden, a tall pine tree started to groan and creak as it started to come down. Noticing this, and in a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward as the tree came falling through the rest of the branches and landed right in between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree landed, and I hopped the tree to get to him. I could feel his heart pounding like a drum as I grabbed him by his shirt and yanked him to his feet. He was still terrified and still practically crying as I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Move, Jacob! Fucking move now!" I spun him around really hard, causing him to fall to his knees. I quickly got him up, and we both started to sprint down the path back in the direction we came. I didn't dare look back, and neither did Jacob. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound came from behind me. Jacob! Jacob, come quick. It was the sound of Jacob's younger sister Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me, The whole time he was screaming Olivia. I stopped him and said, "Jacob, look at me. It's not her. Do you hear me? It's not her." Just then another pine tree started to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob down to the ground as both of us were nearly crushed. I screamed at Jacob once more. "Go. Get out of here. Go now." As I was screaming that, I pulled my gun out of my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction from whence we came. Jacob made it to the opening of the trail and turned back and noticed I was still aiming my gun down the trail. "Bradley, get out of there. Come on, hurry." I turned and started sprinting towards him. As I made it into the clearing a good 50 feet, I turned and me and Jacob both saw it. The thing we had ushered into showing itself. The Wendigo. It stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was practically no meat on its bones. It had really skinny legs and even skinnier arms. Its skin a pale white, almost like a vampire's. But the thing I noticed the most about it were the eyes. A vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Having had enough fear, I raised my gun and fired at the Wendigo. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had killed it, turned and ran towards the car. I turned and did the same thing as he passed me. That was my first experience with this so-called Wendigo, and I pray, almost every night, I never have to encounter something that terrifying again. Second story. There's nothing safe about deer hunting in the Alabama forests. As a southern bumpkin who had grown up in the deep woods, well, more specifically, the bumfuck, middle-of-nowhere Alabama woods, I always get taken back to a very interesting chapter in my life. You see, as a kid, I had always marveled at how constant, yet inconsistent the forest was. The ground always had critters frantically scurrying around the seemingly still leaves. The river kept a constant flow sourced from the loud and chaotic falls we had some miles away. The trees would sway side to side during the stormy seasons, yet stay rooted firmly on the ground. Their leaves would turn all sorts of colors only to disappear completely in the dead of winter. Yup, nothing was safe from change. Come to think of it, strange as it was, even the mannequins changed out there. Now folks, if you think that sentence seemed out of place in my story, imagine how it was for me seeing them for the first time. I remember first spotting them when I was around 6 years old. I barely reached up to my father's knees, but I had finally learned how to stop tripping over my 2 left feet, and Pa felt it was safe enough to let me take a hike with him for the first time. As a girl, the wilderness fascinated and scared me, but I had never once assumed that I would find mannequins in the forest. I could be out with Pa looking for frogs, or trying to find some kindling for our fireplace, and then surprise, a random mannequin not too far from the house would be there waiting for us. Honestly, I use the term mannequins freely, but originally, they were more like bodices, kind of like the ones that Ma would used to use to drape fabric over whenever she would make me some new clothes. Damned kids and their pranks. Scowling, Pa would grip the strap attached to his rifle and scooted me along in the opposite direction from where we came from. "Pay them no mind, kid," he'd say. "Poppy's got a gun." I remember taking my Pa's hand and dwelling on that comment till we got home. I thought it was pretty silly that he wanted to shoot something found in Mama's old sewing room. Why didn't he just put them somewhere else? Or at least kick them down? They weren't menacing, but they sure did startle me sometimes. They always seemed to be everywhere in the woods, almost as if they were following us. Then again, thinking about it some more, it wasn't really a surprise. Lord knows I loved him, but my Pa was a really irresponsible guy. Being the only child Mama could give him before her death, God rest her soul, he was determined to raise me right. He wanted me to be a gun-toting, rough and tumble country kid who could hunt, as well as pick a fight and win it. Admittedly, I had formed some complex because of it, always wondering if just maybe Papa would have been better off with a boy. Let's just say I was desperate to gain his approval. At the ripe old age of 7, he put a firearm in my hands. You see this cricket? This is a Ruger. He'd beam. Back then that rifle had felt too heavy for my string-bin arms to hold. I could barely keep it on my lap. This rifle has been in our family for a long time, kept a lot of us safe and fed, and when you're a little older, I'm going to teach you how to hunt with it. Deer season is where we'll start. I furrowed my brow and looked around the cabin and rested my eyes on the mounted buck head above the fireplace. I don't think I can do it, Pa. Sweet little deer? They ain't little, Pa retorted, and they ain't sweet. You gotta learn how to defend yourself out here. Deer come in all shapes and sizes. I realized then that it was useless to protest. Pa had made up his mind, and even at 7, I knew that he was a stubborn man. There was no winning this battle, so, at the time, I just nodded my head and sadly agreed. Eventually, when I turned 12, Pa deemed me ready. Mostly because as a stocky kid, I could hold on to that rifle. The excitement in my belly bubbling up as he led me out back and stood me in front of the shed made me giddy. He had never allowed me in there. When he flung open those doors, my eyes went as big as saucer plates. A deer right in the garage. It was still doe-eyed and staring right back at me. I walked up to it and Pa stopped me. Hold your horses, Cricket. It's not real, Pa said. It's a decoy, although it's a bit different from those you see in the store. He walked up to the deer. Those are plastic. Fake as they come. He slapped a hand along its back. This one here is stuffed with cotton. We call it taxidermy. He beamed. I'd like to think that deer are a little smarter than what we give them credit for. I know that most of them can spot those fake things a mile away. This here doe, well, it's never failed me before, and we're gonna use it as bait for when we go hunting. We're gonna teach you to shoot. As soon as he had said that, a familiar feeling of dread washed over me. I didn't want to kill anything, but I wasn't about to make Pa upset. The hunting grounds were beautiful. Pa found a bush to hide behind, and a great clearing that he mentioned was known for buck sightings. Just let me set this up, he said. He set the fake doe on a sunny area of the clearing. Gotta make sure the doe doesn't fall over if the bucka hugs them. I rolled my eyes. He got out some ground anchors and rope and got to work rooting her firmly to the spot. After scattering some leaves to hide the materials, Dad smiled. Perfect. He looked back at me. Let's get to hunting. The first day of hunting was uneventful. The first round of bucks had mistakenly, or rather, correctly assumed the doe was a threat and went in for the attack, which wouldn't have been a problem had my hands not been so shaky. I couldn't exactly hit a moving target, much less an aggressive-looking one. Every time I'd reluctantly put my gun down, Pa would say, "It's okay. We'll get him next time." As the sun went down, every missed kill left me feeling disappointed. Pa was determined, though. No matter how tired he looked, he would repeat the same thing. "It's okay. We'll get him next time." Followed by a condescending pat on the back. Failed shot after failed shot, and shell after shell, there Pa would be, reassuring me that we would definitely get him next time. These ritualistic embarrassments would keep going on for about 3 weeks. Some days we'd have to start all over and move to a new spot because a mannequin appeared on our preferred clearing. Those were the worst. Pa would get angry, and we'd have to lug that doe further away from where we parked. All because of those stupid, then department store-looking mannequins. By the end of it all, what with the constant runaround and the failed hunting trips, I had only managed to scare away several animals and grazed too many trees. I had just about had it. On the last day of the 3rd week, I remembered walking back to the car, hanging my head and kicking the dirt beneath my feet. Pa patted my back. It's okay. We'll get him next time. I could feel the blood boiling in my skin. I'm tired of this, Pa. I said, I'm just not a hunter. Pa sighed, not yet, but you will be. We'll get him next T-dash. Stop saying that. No, we won't. I screamed, we won't ever get him 'cause I can't use this thing to save my life. I held my Ruger out in front of me. My father's eyes scanned mine. His face, stone cold. Put that back on you. Don't ever take it off out here, do you understand? And don't keep saying you won't kill. You have to learn how to protect yourself. Dash. I'm freaking 12 and you're forcing me to shoot animals, so I can learn how to use this thing? I griped the weapon hard. Guess what? I don't want it. I threw the gun towards my father. My dad, not expecting it, failed to angle himself, and the steel ended up clocking him square in the nose. God damn it. Blood started to trickle out from his nose where the gun had landed. It wasn't long before the yellow leaves at his feet started turning a crimson red. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it, Pa. The pain I felt grow on my cheek after Dad had slapped me wasn't as bad as the shame I felt from him saying, Kit, it's time you grow the fuck up. It's an eat or be eaten world out there. He shoved the gun onto my hands. I looked up at him. Just because you couldn't stop Mom from dying doesn't mean I have to pay for it. You know, if your mama saw you now, I know she'd be real let down, he snapped. With that remark being enough, I ran for the woods. Anywhere away from him. I ran and ran, ignoring my dad's cries for me to come back. I don't know if Dad wanted to give me space, or if I managed to lose him. I don't even know if he followed me. I certainly couldn't hear him chasing me through my running. I collapsed onto the dirt, wondering if he would leave me out there, wondering if maybe I deserved it. I wiped my tear-stained cheeks and sprawled out down on the ground. Looking up at the sky, I was sure Mama was let down by me, which only made me cry some more for a good while. After about 10 minutes of self-pity, I got that familiar feeling of nausea most kids get after not eating and running about half a mile through forest. I rubbed my belly. We hadn't eaten since this morning. I closed my eyes. Thinking back, if I remember correctly, I think we passed a berry bush on the way to the hunting grounds. That's a mulberry bush, Kit, Dad had told me. If you ever get hungry, it's safe to enjoy them for a little snack. Just wash them first. I looked around. The bush couldn't have been that far from where I was. Unfortunately, 15 minutes later of endless wandering and searching had me realize that I was completely and utterly lost. Where was Dad? Had he really left me there? I started picking up my pace through the woods. I glanced down at my watch. 5 p.m. It was starting to get dark. I tried brushing away the fear by focusing on something else. I started looking at the clouds as I walked. Hopefully, I would make my way out of the thick wilderness and onto a campsite. Hopefully, there would be people there. Hopefully, there would be food. Was Daddy looking for me? He must be worried. I should apologize when I find him. I strained my eyes ahead of me, searching for a clearing. I gasped when I saw him. Out ahead, about 40 feet away from me, was a person. I ran towards them, waving my arms and screaming in the loudest voice I could muster. Please wait. Please. Desperately trying to get their attention. Thankfully, they seemed to be preoccupied with whatever they were looking at. When I was close enough, I struggled to catch my breath, gasping for air, and stumbled onto the ground. I'm glad I caught you, I gasped, as I struggled to catch my breath. But looking up, to my dismay, was yet another mannequin. I felt my cheeks growing hot. I slammed my hands on the ground in frustration. Of course it was. It always is. I rolled my eyes and threw down my gun in disgust. How could I mistake a mannequin for a person? I lifted my head. The realization kicked in. I mistook a mannequin for a person. I had never done that before. I looked at it again. This was a really convincing one. They had never looked this real before. I tilted my head and observed it a little more closely. It was standing in some kind of awkward, mid-motion gesture with its right hand raised up as if to say hello, beaming this toothy, half-open smile. Honestly, this one had to be the best yet. The hair was so realistic. Not like that horsehair you see some wigs made out of. It looked so fine and wispy. The teeth were naturally crooked and had a slightly yellow tinge to them. The gums showed a glossy sheen. There were cracks on its lips and its tongue. Every pore on its face was visible. It even had little veins on the side of its nose. I examined his body. Strangely enough, though, the clothes he wore looked more like he was ready to go to some highfalutin restaurant than roughing it in the woods. He looked like some kind of caricature. I laughed at the uncanniness of it all. Ironic that the fakest thing about the mannequin was its outfit. Well, that, and it also hadn't moved the entire time I stared at it. But still, it looked so human. What the heck is this? I stepped closer, slightly freaked out, and slightly wanting to get a feel of it. It couldn't be real. No way. I wasn't 5 feet away from the thing before I felt something tug me back. I turned around to see Pa's angry face. What did I tell you about not having your gun on you? I felt the tears well up in my eyes. Poppy. Pa pointed to the muffs as he held the gun. Put them on. Put them on. Alarmed, I raised my muffs to my ears. Bam! Daddy fired 5 shots into seemingly nowhere deep in the forest, with the last one blasting the mannequin. What are you doing? I cried. He grabbed my hand, and with a panic I'd never seen in him before, threw both of our muffs on the ground as we ran. I swiveled my head back to the mannequin. It miraculously hadn't fallen over from the blast. That half-open smile now gone as its jaw had been blown clean off. Pieces of flesh were hanging on below its nose. It didn't look like a mannequin anymore. I could see white stuff was scattered all over the leaves at its feet. I saw more, falling out of the hole from its upper jaw. It took 12 minutes of non-stop running before Pa and I made it out of the woods and back into the truck. The entire time I saw Pa frantically looking back throughout our surroundings. He could barely get the key in the lock with how bad his hand was shaking. After he tossed me in truck, he got in, slammed his door shut, started the engine and pressed on the pedal with a frantic desperation, driving out of the forest and swerving around the mountains at a speed that terrified me. Pa, please slow down. You're gonna kill us. I screamed. Pa looked at me for a second. Didn't you hear it? The look on Pa's frantic, wild eyes chilled me to my core. I'll never forget them. I sat there and tried to remember what I had, at the time, thought was just my imagination as we ran away. Maybe my muffs hadn't been on right when Pa fired his gun and my ears had played tricks on me. But after Pa had ripped off our muffs, when we were running away, I could have sworn that I had heard someone say something deep in those bushes. Don't worry, we'll get them next time. Third story. A deer keeps staring through my window. Hi, first-time poster here. I want to know if the things I have seen recently are like normal behavior, and if so, how do I get the deer to stop looking through my window? So, I know that deer are pretty spookable creatures. Hell, I have lived in the Northern California mountains for several years, never really liking nature too much, but much preferring the solitary nature of living in a small community and living in a house that is flanked with tall pine trees. I enjoy my privacy. But back to what's going on. Yesterday I was sitting in my yard with my laptop, working on some late classwork I had neglected for a few Netflix binges and a few drunken nights when a deer walked by. Nothing too out of the ordinary, and I had paused to watch the large buck walk through my yard. Normally, they don't seem to pay me much attention, but this time as soon as it saw me, it stared, turned its head to look at me better. I waited to see if it would eventually walk away, but it just didn't. It actually walked closer to me. Now, I'm not too versed in how to deal with bucks, or deer really, but I didn't see any females or any fawns, so I figured if I raised my voice, it would probably leave, or at least stop. It did stop when I yelled, momentarily, but then it just kept walking closer until it was roughly 9 feet away from me. I finally decided that this was way too close and proceeded to yell, "Hey, get out of here," and then go home. Don't make fun of my feeble attempts to get the buck to leave. I have only ever had to deal with a few of my neighbor's dogs getting into my yard, and usually a stern "go home" gets them right on their way. Evidently, this buck was not a dog and did not actually listen. Well, the buck didn't really seem to want to close the distance. I carefully collected up my phone and laptop, making sure to not make too many sudden movements, and made my way inside. Making sure to not break eye contact, I really did not want to get in a chase with the buck, especially if the buck had a head start when I wasn't looking. I got inside, locked my doors, and made the executive decision that I was done studying and that I needed a beer and a few episodes of whatever show I could get to catch my interest. But when I grabbed the beer and looked out the window to my backyard, there is the deer's head, staring through my window and into my soul. Now this deer must have been standing on its hind legs to look in. I am 5 feet 9 inches and my head does not even reach to the bottom of the window when I am standing out there. But there is the deer. I can see a good portion of its neck and the entirety of its head, an absolutely massive rack of horns. How can I get this deer to stop looking through my window? He's making it pretty hard to get invested into any shows, and it's been a few hours. He's not leaving, and I'm pretty sure he licked my window when I was making dinner. Fourth story, Wendigo story. I honestly don't know where to start, or if I'm ready to be posting this story of mine, but hopefully it'll help. I know you won't believe me, and honestly I won't even blame you guys. It still doesn't make sense in my own head. I've heard stories about unknown creatures in woods, but never thought I'd encounter one myself, you know? I posted another story about some creepy old people that I had encountered in the woods, but that's nothing. This makes a good horror story for people, but it eats me every day. But here we go. I love to go hiking. I go with my 3-year-old German Shepherd, and let her go unleashed since we like to go to secluded places. Now I have been hiking all over Utah mountains and wanted a new hike that wasn't too far from me. I have an app that tells me about hikes near me, if it is a hard hike, reviews, and if it's dog-friendly. Now I was scrolling through All Trail looking for possibly something new, but I wasn't too hopeful. But to my delight, there was something new. I don't know why I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember it was at the bottom of the list, and it had one review saying good. I thought that was kind of strange, mostly because people love to review hikes and try to tell the city what they can do to improve the hike and make it more safe, but I figured it wasn't a popular hike. So the next day Kyrie and I packed up our stuff and went up towards the hike. I always carry first aid kit, extra food, a knife, and just emergency stuff in case I get lost. It's important to mention now that Kyrie eats a raw diet, meaning she eats raw meat not cooked, and since we were going so early in the morning I thought I could bring some with us. I put it in her blue backpack I make her wear and decided when it was getting warmer we would stop to eat. Where I live, there's a long drive through the canyon and many roads going towards the hike you'd like to go on. This one was a little further than I'm used to, but I didn't care. It was new, and I was excited. So was Kyrie. She cries in the car until we get there. Now I was following the directions on my phone and saw that it had led me towards a thin road that was hidden. No wonder I haven't heard of this place. It was hidden and far up the mountain. The road only fit one car, so the whole time I was so anxious that another car would come down. and how I would handle that, but there never was. I never saw another car. When I got to the parking lot, if I could call it that, I noticed there was only space for like 3 cars, all in a tight space. It was small, so I decided to park my car with the front facing towards the road. I thought maybe it was private property, checked the app, but it didn't say anything about private property. I shrugged it off, got Kyrie out, prepared us, and saw the trail. Now, even though I knew there wasn't anyone parked there, I kept Kyrie on a leash. I didn't know if there were bikers along the trail, but after 30 minutes or so, I didn't see anyone. I decided to let her off leash. It was a steep hike for the first half, but it was beautiful. We were deep in the woods, and I felt at peace. I used to wear headphones when I hiked, but didn't anymore, so I was enjoying the natural sounds of the forest. It was still early in the morning, so I wore a light jacket and decided when it got warmer I'd give Kyrie her breakfast. Now, before you start to hate, I know bringing Kyrie's raw meat was absolutely stupid and ignorant of me. I had never seen a bear or wolf or anything, so I got cocky and just thought it was okay. I learned my lesson the bad day, so no need to tell me I was dumb. But honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you commented that. Now here is where we begin the bad part of this story. The trail finally stopped being steep and sort of an easy hike from here. When you got to the top, you could see through the trees a beautiful open meadow. On the other side of it, you can hear a river and a waterfall. The trail went around the meadow. The meadow was absolutely beautiful with the mountains in the background, the sound of the water. This hike was almost the most beautiful one I had ever been to. When Kyrie and I were sort of in the center of the meadow, she stopped right in front of me and looked towards the meadow. Kyrie always walked ahead of me, and when she stopped, I stopped since I trusted her judgment. Before I could look, the smell hit me first. You know, the typical rotting smell, but oh my God, words cannot explain how bad it stank. It burned my nose and started to make me tear up. I put my shirt over my nose, feeling nauseous, and looked over to where Kyrie was looking. In the middle of the meadow was a deer. Now, I've only seen does, but never a male deer in person, but his antlers were huge. Have you ever seen Princess Mononoke? When he sees the deer spirit walking across the water, and how big his antlers were. Almost like that. The beauty of the deer was amazing, but not enough to take away the disgusting smell that was making me sick. The deer was looking towards the mountains and away from me. I thought maybe Kyrie's food was going bad. I checked that and it seemed fine. When I looked up again, the deer was looking towards our direction. I noticed that Kyrie's hackles went up at that. She started to cry nervously. Now, I've heard of wendigos and skinwalkers. I am Native American. It is common for these creatures to be in our childhood stories. That, and also listening to scary stories on YouTube. Now, when Kyrie did that, I got a bad feeling in my stomach despite the sickness. It was a wendigo and I knew that. Now I didn't know what to do. These creatures were only a part of my stories to make me go to bed, not to instructions of what to do. Plus, my grandmother was the one with the stories and passed away. She was the one with the experience, not my mom or anyone else. I glanced at Kyrie again when she cried and looked back towards the creature. It started to stand on its hind legs. Holy hell, it was fucking tall, and it faced my direction. It started to walk towards me. I was going to run until I heard in my head, "I am the one of this land." Suddenly it started to run towards me, full speed. I screamed, called Kyrie, and started to run. Kyrie was following behind me. I started to cry as I was running since I could hear it catch up to me. It was loud. It was destroying everything it came in contact with to get to me. The adrenaline running through me was making me just focus on running. I didn't know where to go, I just ran. The trail suddenly got smaller and bushes with thorns started to appear, but I didn't feel them as they cut my arms. As I heard it got closer, it suddenly went to the left as I ran straight. I somehow had the balls to look back to see it was gone, but also Kyrie. Kyrie? I said, but right as I called out for her, the trail ended with a foot drop onto a patch of rocks. I hit my head, bleeding a bit, but again I couldn't feel it that much and just got up. I looked towards the forest when I suddenly heard a loud cry from my right. It was Kyrie. Kyrie! I cried out. I stood up, crying and lost at what to do. I looked back to see a river leading up to the waterfall I heard. Suddenly a heavy weight ran into me, and we both fell back. I hit my head again on the back and looked up to see Kyrie. Kyrie had blood all over her. It was pouring from her neck. Kyrie? I cried out. She was whimpering and breathing heavy. She still had her backpack on with some cuts in it. Before I had a chance to help her, a scream came from the forest. I looked back at the waterfall and somehow had the strength to pick up my 85-pound dog and carry her. I don't know where I was planning to go. I was just running to the waterfall as if it was a safe place. I was almost there when I heard the creature land on the rocks that I did early. I tripped at that and looked back to see it looking at me. Its eyes were black, or I think so. It could also be that there wasn't anything in there. I don't know. I took off Kyrie's backpack and threw it towards the monster, hoping it would take the meat and just leave us alone. I was scooting back towards the waterfall, crying as I did so, holding and dragging Kyrie with my left arm. I found that being so close to the creature made me literally weak to my knees. It walked over to me, taking huge steps. It looked so different than before. Before it looked like a deer, and now as it crawled over to me it looked like a monster. I don't know how else to describe this awful demon. I don't.
I'm sorry.
But I felt water hit my head hard as I had reached the waterfall. I kept going until I was up against the wall. There barely enough space where water wasn't hitting Kyrie and his faces. Kyrie felt limp at this point. I could somewhat see the creature through the water, but still saw it coming towards me. It stood on its hind legs when it was close enough to me, watching me. The smell was so disgusting. I couldn't help but throw up in my mouth. It reached his arms out to grab me. I screamed so loud. I actually lost my voice. After I let out that scream, another scream came from the deep forest. The creature snapped its head almost completely backward, looking towards the scream. The scream sounded like the one this one had let out earlier. I was still holding onto Kyrie, crying and screaming since its arm was close. It looked back to me, pulling its arm away, and again said in my mind, "I am the one of this land." With that, it took steps back watching me and went down the riverbank. It crawled on all fours, stopping next to Kyrie's backpack. It ripped it apart and pulled out the meat, eating it with the plastic bag that it was in. It suddenly screamed and ran towards that direction of the scream from earlier. When I thought it was gone, I stood up shakily and carried Kyrie towards the trail again. When I was running, I came across my backpack that I had left earlier and stopped. It was ripped apart, so I took off my jacket and wrapped it around Kyrie's neck where she was bleeding a lot. After that, I barely remember. All I remember is carrying Kyrie and driving down, screaming the whole way towards the emergency vet. They asked us what happened, and I told them it was a bear. They called the ambulance since I had blood all over me, and they couldn't tell if it was mine or Kyrie's. Kyrie made it through surgery and had to have some stitches on her, along with a pad. It didn't really heal, and a huge bump grew on there. It had been infected, but eventually got better. She also had a bite mark on the top of her left eye, but that healed much better. They pulled out a 4-inch tooth. I don't have it because I couldn't even look at it, but they declared it from a bear, even though they said it looked weird. While I was waiting for Kyrie, I went to look up the trail on the app, and it was gone. Why or how, but it is. I don't remember where it is either. That's all a blur. I have some pictures up of Kyrie. The one with my niece is a hike my mom took her on with my niece. It had been weeks after, and my mom thought to try and help her through it. Kyrie looks nervous in the picture, but you can see the huge bump on the left side of her neck. There's also a picture with Kyrie and her bandages around her neck. And the one that is the most recent of her neck, it's black. The stitches came out. The last picture is of the top of her head, also black, but it's healed now. I'll find some way to post them. I haven't been hiking since, and I refuse to let Kyrie go. That time my mom took her, she did it while I was at work, but regretted it because she said Kyrie was crying and was so scared they had to just go home. My mom knows. I screamed at night from nightmares for a week or two. My mom put white candles in my room to get rid of the bad spirits attracted to my negativity. So yeah, here's my story. I've heard stories where people saw a wendigo and they didn't get harmed. And God, I wish I went through that. I hate hiking. My therapist thinks I may have some PTSD, but only knows of it as a bear. I'm getting through it. Kyrie is too. Hopefully one day I can go back, but I don't see that being for a while. Please, if you're going to go up to the mountains, please prepare. Mother Nature is not only unpredictable, but has things in there that just don't make sense in our heads. So please be safe. I say that with serious sincerity. If there's any other subreddits I can post this to, I would love to know, so I can share my story and maybe help others out there. Fifth story. The deer. The problem with having a rational mind is its tendency to break when confronted with the irrational. I have always considered myself to possess such a mind, though this viewpoint is one that I have recently come to reconsider. I do not mean to portray myself as a lunatic, but it has come to pass in recent weeks that I am no longer able to offer plausible excuses for my behavior. Instead, I constantly ask myself one question. Are my experiences the cause of my lack of sanity, or are they merely a symptom of it? I pray for the latter. I grew up with my parents and siblings in a small cottage in the countryside surrounding Wareham, Dorset. It's part of what used to be a hamlet in the 1800s, but around the turn of the 20th century it was incorporated into the larger village about 2/3 of a mile away. There are a few neighboring cottages, all connected to the main road out of the village proper by a tarmac driveway about 1/4 of a mile long. Up until the age of about 12 or 13, it is a fantastic place to live, with plenty of fields to explore and play football in. Above that age, it begins to tire due to what I would personally describe as a lack of teenage interests. Nevertheless, with a regular bus service out of the village and a bicycle to get to the stop, I was freely able to visit friends in the surrounding villages and larger town, so I never ended up feeling totally isolated. I ended up becoming quite an avid cyclist, and when I turned 17 decided not to get driving lessons for my birthday, but rather an expensive racing bike. University came, and a city half the way across the country came with it. Still, I got back to see my parents and friends every time I got a break from university. It was during the most recent of these trips home that I dropped out and remained home. A couple of months back, I came back home for the Easter break. I had brought home my textbooks and notes for courses for which I should currently be taking exams. I was in my final year, but although final exams were close, I have always been a good student and didn't feel the need to study for more than a few hours a day. In the evenings, I would either stay home with my parents or go out and visit my friends, for which I would need to make the usual bike-bus excursion. This involves riding my bicycle to the bus stop where I would lock it to a railing, then getting the bus out of the village. I then return by bus and either ride or walk my bike home depending on my level of intoxication. I think it was my second or third such trip of the holidays when I encountered the deer. I had returned from a night with my friends, and having only had a couple of pints, I deemed myself capable of riding home. So, after pulling my helmet from my backpack, I unlocked my bike, switched the lights on, and started riding back the roughly mile-long journey. About 2 minutes in, my headlight picked out the distinctive silhouette of a deer standing across the road. This by itself wasn't unusual, though the fact that it made no attempt to move away from my approaching path was. Stranger still, as I got closer I noticed that it was staring directly away from me, into the distance. Deer, I usually find, are particularly nervous creatures around humans. Normally you've barely seen them at night, just making out a slight movement as they escape having noticed you long before you noticed them. This one, however, was stuck steadfast, intently staring down the road and paying me no notice whatsoever. A few yells at it yielded no success in causing any movement, so I concluded it to be deaf. Seeing no other solution, I decided to get off my bike and shift the deer physically. I wasn't any more than 6 inches away from touching it before it darted away. I made the rest of the journey home and thought no more of it until 2 nights later when I went out again. This time, I had drunk considerably more and made the decision to push my bike back. I switched the headlamp on for visibility, plugged in my earphones, and set about walking home. This time, I noticed the deer slightly earlier. I immediately thought it must be the same deer, as it was occupying the exact same pose, and likewise paid no attention to the approaching noise I was creating. I walked up to shift it again, and noticed that the pose had actually slightly changed since I'd last seen it. This time its head wasn't turned so far, in that it was still staring away from me but no longer directly so. Again, it ran off before I could touch it. Despite my intoxication, nerves caused me to hasten my journey home by riding my bike. The adrenaline and loss of balance caused me to veer sharply at the turning of the driveway, and I slipped, grazing my leg and tearing my jeans. That night, the memory of the deer remained in my head, culminating in a nightmare the details of which I do not remember. But I woke in a cold sweat that night and had trouble returning to sleep. It was from here that events began to cascade. The following day presented my first encounter with the deer in daylight. It was around noon, and my mother had entered my room to find me half asleep and feeling more hungover than expected. "What happened here?" she asked, picking up last night's jeans and gesturing to the tear. "Rode home drunk. Hangovers are prone to making me blunt, but luckily she needed a favor from me. So I got away with a disapproving look and a letter to take to the post office. I got out of bed, showered, dressed, and began walking to the village, forgoing the bike due to the hangover. This time, the deer was just past the turning to my driveway, approximately the place at which I'd fallen the night before. Seeing it only as I turned into the road, I had a sudden recollection of last night's nightmare and promptly turned around and began sprinting back. This reaction afforded me only a quick glimpse of the creature. I noticed nothing exceptional about it except that its head was turned around even less than the night before, so I was certain that it must have seen me with the eye on my side. Returning home, I handed the letter back to my mother, claiming to have been sick along the journey. This third sighting cemented my fear of the creature and led to a few days of feigning sickness in order to avoid leaving the house. This act was made easier to perform due to my sleepless nights. After insistence from my parents that I visit a doctor, I decided it was time to recover. At this point, my father suggested that he could drive me into town so I could buy some new jeans. I had no desire to leave and encounter the deer again, but finding no excuse not to go that would sound sane, I found myself in the passenger seat of the car. I was shaking and sweating with fear, which didn't go unnoticed. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine, maybe just still a bit ill." Fortunately, despite my fear, the deer made no appearance that day. The relief was fantastic, causing my panic to subside slightly, and agreed with only minor nervousness with my parents to go out for a meal with them that evening. This, too, passed without incident, and I caught my first full night's sleep in days. I awoke feeling refreshed and brave, and agreed to a text I received inviting me to a poker game that evening. I felt the first sense of trepidation the moment I pushed my bike from the garage, and the sense of bravery I had felt in the morning was very much dulled at this point. The temptation not to go was strong, but determination gripped me. It was, after all, simply a deer. Why should I let it govern my life? I resolved myself to go, riding out at dusk and at a fast pace. As the fear rose up inside me, I rode faster and faster until I was almost sprinting on the pedals. Racing down the road, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. A sudden gust of wind violently hit me, causing me to both swerve and instinctually close my eyes. Upon opening them, the deer was there, in front of me, no further than 30 feet down the road. With no time to stop, I swerved to its side, thinking myself about to fall off. I managed to right myself, but overcompensated. I must have been going around 25 miles an hour, and in getting past the deer, I felt my leg slam against its snout. Not looking back, I pedaled as fast as I could to the village, while hearing an almighty cry from behind. It sounded like the kind of cry cats are capable of when there are 5 of them fighting in an alley at 2 a.m., but much louder, and with a deep, booming quality. Arriving at the bus stop white as paste, shaking uncontrollably and sweating profusely, I was refused to access the bus on the grounds that the conductor felt I would be sick all over it. Despite my protests, I was forced to wait for the next bus. The bus rolled out of sight, and the fear grew as time went on. I was faced with an impossible dilemma. Waiting for the bus meant a possibility of seeing the deer again, while riding home meant an almost certainty of the same thing. However, I would have to go home sometime. I decided to control myself, wait for the next bus, and try to get a lift home from one of my friends with a driving license. Minutes passed. The time of the next bus approached and passed, but the bus did not. The panic increasing, I started to hear that same noise, only quietly. That cat fighting, chalkboard scratching, metal shovel scraping on dry cement noise. Getting on my bike, I tried to pinpoint the direction the noise was coming from, so that I could ride in the opposite one. I found this to be impossible. The noise was growing louder, and moreover seemed to be coming from every direction. Seeing no alternative, I began to sprint my bike home. I cannot explain the behavior of the noise in any way that makes sense, except that it followed me and got progressively louder. It was as though someone was slowly increasing the volume of 2 speakers directly above my head that were invisible to me. The noise growing to a crescendo. I saw the deer in the distance, that familiar sideways outline. Deciding my only chance was to ride past again. I prepared myself this time and got myself as close to the side of the road as I could. I approached the deer, the sound now cacophonous, before it cut out completely as I rode past. An primal, instinctual, terrified part of me refused to look at the animal, but I couldn't avoid seeing the position of its head, now almost, but not quite pointed in my direction. Arriving home, and offering utterly no explanation to my confused parents as to my early arrival and terrified appearance, I disappeared into my room and locked the door. That was 2 months ago, and though I have ventured downstairs, I have refused to leave the house, unless accompanied by someone else. Though I am physically unhurt, my nights are still plagued with its presence. It appears that the deer cannot, or will not, appear in the presence of someone who isn't me. If it isn't memories of the deer that's keeping awake at night, it's questions of my own sanity. As far as I know, nobody else has seen it. It hasn't attacked me or hurt me, and I have no physical proof that it exists. I cannot explain my situation because I know that from anyone else's point of view, I would simply be a madman. For all I know, this is true. Looking at it objectively, it must be all in my head. But the fear wins. I do not leave the house by myself, because if I am by myself, I will see the deer. And though it has done nothing to me, I have seen its head turn towards me more and more every time I see it. And I don't want to know what will happen when it finally looks at me.